The most unsettling part wasn't realizing something was wrong, it was realizing how much effort I had put into staying calm. Every time I chose patience over clarity, something moved forward without me. I thought waiting was protecting the relationship, but it was actually protecting whatever didn't need my consent anymore. By the time I felt ready to ask real questions, the answers weren't forming, they were already finished. And that's when it hit me, I wasn't late to the truth. I was on time to the consequences. My name is Liam. I'm 28 years old, and I work construction in a small suburb just outside Seattle. The kind of place where mornings smell like wet asphalt and pine trees and the sky always looks undecided, and most days, that uncertainty feels like the most exciting thing that's going to happen. My life runs on a rhythm so predictable it barely feels like time passing at all. And for a long while, I told myself that was exactly how I wanted it. Even though some part of me knew routines like this don't stay harmless forever. I wake up at 6, pour black coffee into a dented thermos, grab my keys, and climb into my beat-up Ford truck that rattles every time I turn the ignition. By 7, I'm on the job site, boots sinking into damp ground, hands rough from lumber and concrete, framing houses that other people will one day call home. By afternoon, I'm coated in dust and sweat, muscles aching in a way that feels earned and honest. Construction makes sense to me. You build, you fix, you measure twice and cut once. Mistakes show immediately. And if something's crooked, you don't pretend it isn't, you correct it. There's comfort in that kind of clarity. I rent a tiny apartment barely bigger than a garage, with a kitchenette that smells like old takeout no matter how much I scrub and a bed that creaks every time I roll over. It isn't much, but it's functional. And for a long time, that felt like enough. I don't have money socked away or a future mapped out in neat stages. I've got enough to pay rent, keep gas in the truck, and grab a beer with the guys on Fridays. No vacations, no milestones, no real plans beyond getting through the next week. I told myself ambition was overrated. That peace came from lowering expectations, even though the quiet in that apartment sometimes pressed a little too hard against my chest. I hadn't been on a date in 2 years. Not because of some dramatic heartbreak or a betrayal that shattered me, but because I got tired of forced conversations, polite smiles, and being asked about 5-year plans like everyone's life comes with a blueprint. Mine doesn't. Mine is more of a day-to-day survival guide. I've been ghosted, stood up, and gently let down more times than I care to count, always with the same undertone, you're a good guy, but not quite enough. Eventually, I stopped trying. Solitude felt easier, safer. No hope meant no disappointment. Or so I told myself. I convinced myself this quiet life was chosen, not settled for, even though deep down I knew it was starting to feel less like peace and more like hiding. Then Maya called. Maya's been my best friend since high school, the kind who sticks around even when you make it clear you don't want company. We don't talk every day, but when we do, it matters. She called one evening just after 9. When the sky outside my window had gone dark and the weight of the day had settled into my bones. Liam, she said, half amused, half concerned, you can't just fade into the background forever. You're turning into a hermit. I laughed it off, told her I was fine, that this was just how life was now, but she didn't buy it. She never does. One blind date, she pushed. If it's a disaster, I'll buy you beer for a month. I tried to argue, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. She wasn't wrong. I'd been dodging life more than living it. In the end, I agreed, not because I believed anything would come of it, but because I'd run out of excuses. I figured the worst that could happen was another forgettable evening. I didn't know then that this small, reluctant yes was about to crack open a life I'd kept carefully sealed, or that the quiet I clung to was far more fragile than I realized. The cafe sat at the end of a quiet street, warm but unpretentious, and I arrived 10 minutes early out of habit, choosing a small table by the window where I could see the door and, if needed, the parking lot beyond it, an old reflex from years of wanting exits even from harmless situations, reminding myself this was just a favor to Maya. One evening, nothing I had to carry past tonight, the low hum of conversation and the steady hiss of the espresso machine filling the space as I scrolled my phone and rehearsed polite lines meant to end things cleanly if they turned awkward. When the door opened and she stepped inside, pausing as if she needed a second to brace herself, scanning the room with cautious eyes before finding mine, her shoulders slightly hunched, brown hair tucked behind one ear, and something guarded in the way she moved that made me sit up straighter without knowing why. She walked over and offered a small, careful smile, introduced herself as Laura, and we shook hands briefly, her grip firm but quick, the kind that didn't linger. And for a few minutes the conversation stayed safely on the surface: jobs, schedules, the kind of exchanges designed to pass time rather than reveal anything real, as she told me she worked as a nurse in burn care, her voice calm and professional, and I talked about construction, long days, the satisfaction of seeing something solid take shape, all of it easy, almost forgettable, until she fell quiet and glanced down at her sleeve, fingers worrying the cuff as if she'd reached an internal decision, then looked back up at me with an expression that wasn't nervous so much as resolved. She took a breath, rolled up her sleeve slowly, and the world seemed to narrow to that single movement as thick, raised scars came into view, twisting lines of healed burns running from her wrist up her arm and disappearing beneath the fabric, permanent and unapologetic. And for a brief moment neither of us spoke, the cafe noise dulling to a distant blur as she held my gaze, waiting, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate, before saying evenly, "No one wants to date me," the words landing without bitterness or self-pity, just fact. And I knew she was watching for the reaction she'd seen too many times before, the flicker of discomfort, the polite retreat, but I didn't look away, didn't feel the urge to fill the space with reassurances, and instead reached out and gently pulled her sleeve back down, not to hide anything but to acknowledge that she didn't owe me explanations on demand. And when I told her I wasn't going anywhere, that walking out would be the only thing I'd regret, her eyes searched my face as if testing for cracks, fear and weariness mingling with a cautious spark of disbelief, and for a moment the silence returned, different now, heavier but not awkward, the kind that let something settle rather than escape, until she asked quietly if I really wanted to hear the story, and when I said yes, only if she was okay telling it, she nodded and began, recounting the fire with steady precision, the smoke alarm at 2 in the morning, the hallway already filled with heat and smoke, the moment her arm caught on a burning railing as she ran, the adrenaline that carried her outside screaming for help, and the way her parents never made it out, her voice never breaking but the weight of the words pressing into the space between us. And I listened without interrupting as she spoke of hospitals, skin grafts, months of pain and recovery, of learning to look at herself again in mirrors she'd once avoided, until she finished with the quiet admission that surviving had once felt like a punishment rather than luck. And when she finally asked why I was still sitting there, I answered honestly, that I recognized the loneliness beneath the scars, the fear of being seen and found lacking, because I carried my own invisible versions of it, and something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, as we talked on, lighter now, about small things and shared exhaustion, agreeing by the end of the night to strip away expectations and start as friends, stepping back out into the cool Seattle air without promises or certainty, only the unfamiliar sense that this meeting, meant to be harmless, had already changed the shape of something quietly important. The next few weeks were measured in small, deliberate steps. Our first real outing after the cafe was a quiet park tucked between warehouses, a space most people passed without noticing. Liam brought sandwiches from a nearby deli, Laura carried coffee, her long sleeves still drawn over her arms despite the crisp morning air. We found a bench near the pond, water dull and murky under the gray Seattle sky, and settled into an easy silence. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for judgment that never came. I watched her, realizing how tentative trust can be, how fragile yet vital the willingness to open up was, and it struck me that this was more than a casual meet-up, it was a test of bravery, an unspoken challenge. She spoke quietly about mundane things at first, the rain, the fog, a patient's funny anecdote, but beneath the surface ran a current of hesitation, the way someone balances hope and fear in the same breath. I offered small confessions, my own walls coming down in tiny increments, summers working odd jobs, the sense of being half a step behind, the careful way I avoided attachments that demanded more than I could give. The park became a safe space for transparency, a place where vulnerability didn't feel dangerous, only necessary. And yet, I could feel her tension, the weight she carried silently on her arms and shoulders, mirrored in my own fears of imperfection and loss. Days later, the playground event at the community center presented a different challenge entirely. Surrounded by children recovering from burns, the air buzzed with activity and nervous excitement. laughter and the occasional cry blending into a chaotic but warm hum. I had invited her casually, not knowing if she'd agree. When she arrived, wearing short sleeves for the first time in daylight, the scars on her arms were stark under the sun, but her posture carried a new kind of steadiness. At first, she hovered at the edge, uncertainty in her gaze, scanning the space, weighing exposure against fear. Then, a little boy with a bandaged hand ran up to her, eyes wide and full of curiosity, asking questions without hesitation. Her initial panic gave way to tentative engagement, kneeling down, answering carefully, teaching them to see their scars not as shame but as marks of strength, badges of survival. Her voice, shaky at first, grew steadier with every smile she coaxed. Every story she spun about a fire princess who had battled flames and emerged stronger. Watching her, I saw courage in action, a resilience that radiated outward, touching the children, myself, and the space around her. It was a kind of empowerment entirely different from the quiet vulnerability at the park, a demonstration that wounds can transform into purpose. That bravery isn't only about revealing pain, but channeling it into something that inspires others. By the end of the morning, she stood back, sweaty and smiling, but her eyes glimmered with the satisfaction of someone who had faced the world on her own terms and found it responsive, not hostile. I realized in that moment that these two sides of her, the cautious, quietly brave woman in the park and the resilient, luminous force at the playground, were pieces of the same person, each demanding respect, patience, and recognition. And for the first time, I understood that being with her would not be about perfection or ease, but about showing up for both her hesitations and her triumphs, witnessing the full spectrum of strength and vulnerability that made her who she was. After the playground event, our time together became quieter, deliberate, each meeting a small test of trust and patience. We started with casual lunches, sandwiches near my job site, coffee at hidden cafes, moving slowly, watching, learning each other without rush. Laura's sleeves shortened gradually, her scars still visible, but no longer walls, more like a map of battles survived. One misty afternoon, we walked along the Puget Sound Trail, gray water stretching endlessly beside us, the wind light, the air thick with quiet. She stayed silent for a long while, hands in her pockets, gaze lowered, as if guarding herself from invisible stares. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, careful. People see these and immediately make assumptions. They pity you, judge you, avoid you. I nodded, understanding without explanation. I let her words linger, the soft whisper of wind filling the pauses. Then I said simply, I don't run, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Her eyes searched mine, looking for hesitation, but found none. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and a small, genuine smile flickered across her face. That moment shifted something. We lingered on the trail long after our coffee cooled, speaking softly about lives, work, the exhaustion of trauma, the satisfaction of creating something tangible, moments that felt safe enough to be real. Weeks later, I invited her to a volunteer project, a playground for children recovering from burns, a space of color, safety, and laughter. She hesitated, glancing at her sleeves, and shook her head, unsure, cautious. I promised to stay by her side. No pressure, just presence. She agreed. The day she arrived, early and measured, shoulders squared, her gaze sweeping the site with practiced caution. I watched her transform, kneeling to tie shoelaces, demonstrating swings, encouraging timid smiles. Her presence radiated quiet authority and warmth. Children gravitated toward her naturally, curious yet unafraid, showing their own bandaged hands, listening as she spun stories of bravery. Scars as badges of resilience. Her laughter was unguarded, radiant, magnetic, not hiding, not apologizing, just fully present, standing back. I realized what drew me to her went far beyond attraction or novelty. It was her courage, the way she faced the world and herself honestly, without illusions, forcing me to confront my own walls, my tendency to retreat for safety. Being near her meant choosing presence, choosing vulnerability. Letting someone see you without pretense. That day, covered in sawdust and paint, we exchanged quiet smiles, gentle reassurances, and I felt something solid grow between us. Not declarations, not grand gestures, just trust forming in real time, built in small moments, ordinary days stitched with patience and consistency. Walks, Coffee, volunteer work, each simple act carried weight. Each shared laugh, each silent understanding, each gesture of care added to a foundation stronger than words, deeper than appearances. Being with Laura became less about testing limits or navigating fear and more about honoring these small, deliberate moments. Showing up mattered, presence mattered, trust mattered, and in those quiet, steady steps, I began to see a life opening beyond routine, beyond solitude, beyond the comfort of the quiet I once clung to. This was not a life of grand drama. It was real, it was steady, it was ours, built slowly, beautifully, in the small moments that no one else would see, but I would never forget. Life settled into a rhythm that was both fragile and comforting, a careful balance between work, quiet companionship, and the lingering shadows of the past. Construction sites still dominated my days, long hours, aching muscles, concrete dust in my hair, but returning to an empty apartment was no longer the norm. Laura waited now, and her presence softened the edges of exhaustion in a way I hadn't realized I needed. She wore long sleeves most days, a habit of protection and self-consciousness, but the subtle shifts caught my attention, the occasional glimpse of her forearm as she reached for a coffee cup, a hand brushing back her hair without thought, the quiet confidence that seemed to bloom in small increments. One evening, after a brutal 12-hour shift, her text appeared, "Rough day, can we walk?" Simple words, yet heavy with unspoken fatigue, a request for connection, not distraction. We met along the waterfront, mist curling off the Sound, droplets clinging to eyelashes, the sharp scent of wet pine in the air. She moved slowly, shoulders tight, voice low as she recounted the day's trials, long surgeries, patients carrying visible and invisible scars, the relentless emotional weight of caring for others while shouldering her own quiet burdens. I listened, taking in every detail, offering no solutions, no clichés, just presence, steady and unwavering, a promise that she did not have to navigate the day alone. For a stretch, we walked in silence, our steps falling into the rhythm of water lapping against the dock, the unspoken conversation between two people learning what it means to share the load. As dusk deepened, we paused at a small overlook, city lights flickering like hesitant stars. Laura traced shapes in the condensation on the railing, then glanced at me. "I'm scared," she admitted, low, careful, not just about work, but about letting anyone see the real me. I reached for her hand, feeling the faint warmth beneath the sleeve she usually left down. "I know," I said softly, "but you don't have to hide from me. I see you, all of you, and I'm not leaving." Relief flickered across her eyes, subtle but undeniable, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. That night, words became secondary. Trust grew in the quiet laugh she let slip when I joked about my own clumsiness, in the way she matched my steps back to our cars, in the unspoken promise to return, to keep showing up. Over the following weeks, these small rituals formed our rhythm: quiet dinners, weekend walks, brief moments of presence that slowly built a scaffold of safety, of mutual respect. And yet, life was never without strain. Her body and spirit still carried the marks of trauma, and my own history of retreating from connection lingered like a cautionary whisper. We were two people navigating vulnerability together, negotiating fear and trust, learning that endurance is not surviving alone but leaning into it together. Every shared smile, every unguarded laugh, every quiet check-in reinforced a lesson neither of us had planned to learn: fatigue shared becomes resilience, the weight carried together becomes strength, and the bond built from these small moments becomes something neither of us had expected but had both longed for in different ways. Autumn draped Seattle in gray, a slow, unrelenting wait, and life rarely offered a pause. But somehow, carrying it felt lighter with Laura in it. Work remained relentless, mornings starting in darkness with the clang of tools, the hiss of machinery, evenings ending in a haze of concrete dust and aching muscles, but the thought of her tethered me, grounded me, made the grind feel less empty. Her texts arrived in quiet threads, a snapshot of the sky from the hospital roof, a note about a difficult patient, a single emoji, and each one reminded me that showing up mattered, even when exhaustion threatened to take over. One rainy afternoon, after a shift that left my shoulders stiff and my head pounding, I pulled up to her apartment, water streaming down the windshield in rivulets, the city a smear of gray-green, the drizzle seeped into bones if you weren't careful. I climbed the narrow stairs, the scent of wet asphalt and pine mingling with faint coffee drifting from a neighbor's window. And knocked lightly. She opened the door, hair damp, eyes tired yet bright, a flicker of warmth cutting through the chill. "Rough day?" I asked, stepping inside, shedding my coat. She sank onto the couch with a sigh, hands twisting the fabric of her sweater. "Some days the exhaustion isn't just physical," she admitted, voice low. I sat beside her, careful to respect space, steady and present, letting the quiet say what words often fail to. She spoke then, about patients who tested every ounce of patience, victories overshadowed by limits she could not change, the weight of scars, her own and others, and the tension of being seen as strong yet human. I listened, silent but anchored, letting her know without saying it that none of this was hers to bear alone. Hours passed, rain drumming against the windows, city lights flickering on beyond the mist, the apartment glowing warm against the damp world outside. Later, we drove to the community center for a midweek volunteer project, prepping for a support event for burn survivors and children recovering from injuries. I watched her interact with the kids, patient, gentle, unafraid of her own scars in their presence, and I realized courage wasn't just survival, it was giving others permission to survive too. On the drive home, headlights reflected off slick streets, and conversation drifted easily from work mishaps to coffee fails, laughter punctuating empathy and trust that had begun to weave us together. By the time we returned to her apartment, night had deepened, yet neither of us moved quickly to part ways, lingering in the doorway, reluctant to step back into solitude. Even amidst fatigue, life felt lighter when shared. In these quiet moments, I understood that endurance was no longer merely surviving, it was witnessing, being present, letting connection carry the weight of struggle so it became something stronger than pain. The storm outside pressed on, relentless, but within the walls of trust and warmth, we discovered rare calm, a steady certainty that no matter the exhaustion, fear, or setbacks, we would meet it side by side, slowly, patiently, together, learning that the small, steady acts of presence mattered far more than any grand gesture ever could. The first chill of early winter bit into Seattle as I climbed into the truck, coffee warming my hands but failing to touch the thoughts circling Laura and the fragile thread we were weaving between us, something delicate yet unbreakable if nurtured with care. Work had been relentless, sawdust and concrete dust coating me like a second skin, but once the day ended, I drove to the park where we had first really opened up, a quiet space where vulnerability had met trust without ceremony. Puddles reflected the gray sky, and swings swayed gently in the wind over the empty playground. The world muted except for the crunch of damp leaves under our boots. Laura arrived moments later, coat pulled tight, hands buried in pockets, eyes scanning the empty paths as if danger could hide behind the trees. We walked side by side, silence stretching between us, a companionable tension, her steps cautious, each one measured as though she were testing the ground for safety. I asked lightly about her week, listening for the rhythm beneath the words, the quiet triumphs, the fatigue, the small victories that spoke louder than any boast, and gradually, her guard began to ease. She told me about patients who surprised her, children whose courage rivaled her own, and moments that made the exhaustion worth it. Her voice steady yet fragile, a reflection of strength born from survival. We reached the playground, and she paused, eyes tracing the sunlight across damp wood, noting children's drawings still pinned to a board, remnants of past volunteer events. For a brief instant, she smiled, tension loosening from her shoulders, imagining laughter and curiosity of kids like her, bearing their own invisible and visible scars. "Do you ever feel like your scars are the only thing people notice?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. I brushed my thumb over her hand as we sat on a bench nearby. "I see you," I said softly. "Everything else is secondary." Relief flickered across her face, a fleeting acknowledgement that she didn't have to shrink, didn't have to hide, even when the world might recoil. A soft click from a distant gate startled us, eyes widening, tension snapping into focus, a reminder that even in moments of safety, vigilance lingered. She laughed, half in relief, half in recognition of the habit she had honed for survival, and I realized how deeply she had internalized caution as a shield before allowing herself to be seen. We stayed on the bench, watching light shift through the trees, words drifting between trivialities and profound truths, each sentence a stitch in the quiet fabric of trust. Shadows lengthened, dusk pressing down, but neither of us moved. There was no rush, only the patient acknowledgement of presence and persistence. When we finally rose, our steps deliberate, I felt the weight of connection, not born of grand gestures, but in enduring small moments, showing up through fear, hesitation, and doubt. The winter air carried a chill, but it couldn't touch the warmth between us. The night was long, but we would endure, side by side, guided by instinct, by care, by the certainty that no unseen shadow could prevent us from facing the world together. And that trust, built quietly in ordinary moments, could withstand anything. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and pine as I made my way to the small cafe where Laura and I had agreed to meet, a quiet rhythm settling between us, anticipation tucked beneath casual greetings. She arrived moments later, scarf wrapped loosely, eyes scanning the space with that practiced caution she had honed over years of vigilance. Yet a soft smile hinted at trust growing in measured increments. We took a table by the window, rain streaking the glass, turning the street into a shimmering blur, and for a few minutes, we simply existed in silence, the comfort of presence more potent than any words. I asked about her patience, listening closely as she described small victories and heavy setbacks, her voice steady but tinged with weariness, the unspoken burdens of caring for those whose pain is both visible and invisible. A flicker of movement behind the counter caught my eye, a shadow brushing past a shelf, and she tensed slightly, mirroring my alertness, the quiet acknowledgement that even here, in this calm, caution lingered. We shared a laugh over minor absurdities of hospital life, the sound dissolving tension for a heartbeat, and I realized how these small, ordinary moments, coffees, shared smiles, carefully chosen words, were building trust, laying scaffolding strong enough to support vulnerability. When she gestured toward the pastries, a playful spark in her eyes, I selected a cinnamon roll with mock ceremony and offered her one with a bow, the simplicity of the gesture a counterpoint to the weight of our conversation. The talk shifted, naturally, to deeper waters, her scars, the stares they drew, the assumptions people carried without awareness, the constant vigilance she maintained to protect herself from pity or judgment. I listened without interruption, letting her words fill the space, giving them room to breathe, silently honoring the courage it took to reveal even a fragment of her truth. The cafe emptied, the soft hum of the espresso machine fading, and she traced patterns on her cup, absent-minded and tense. I reached across, letting my hand rest lightly near hers, a gesture that spoke of solidarity without intrusion. "You make it easier," she said quietly, eyes searching mine. Relief and uncertainty woven together. I squeezed gently. "It's not about fixing, it's about being here, with you." The tension in her posture eased, a subtle shift that made the moment feel vast and significant. We lingered, letting the pause stretch, savoring the quiet proof that trust could grow in small increments. That courage often meant showing up, step by careful step. When we finally rose, rain had tapered into mist, streets reflecting the gray light like molten glass. And as we walked side by side, I understood that these moments, silent, ordinary, deliberate, were building something far stronger than attraction or infatuation. They were building a bond of patience, honesty, and unwavering presence, resilient enough to endure the storms yet to come. The day faded gently, but certainty remained, a quiet promise that we would face life together, one small act of trust at a time, walking through the shadows and into the fragile, steady light we were slowly creating. Late afternoon light slanted through the apartment blinds, streaking the damp streets below with gold, and I climbed the steps to meet Laura, the chill in the air hinting at fall's approach. She was already there, seated on the balcony with a sketchpad on her knees, fingers smudged with charcoal and paint, absorbed in her own quiet world. Her eyes lifted as I approached, softening when they met mine, carrying that familiar mix of hesitation and anticipation I'd come to recognize over weeks of shared mornings, coffees, and walks. "Hey," I said, leaning against the railing beside her, the weight of comfort and unspoken concern settling between us. She didn't answer immediately, tracing delicate lines across the page, abstract forms wrestling with light and shadow, a reflection of the balance she sought in herself. The sun caught her scars just so, and for a moment they seemed sculptural. Not reminders of pain but silent testaments to endurance. Finally, she spoke, low and steady. "I've been thinking about that night, the one that started all this." I nodded, memories of her fire and survival vivid, And we shared a quiet understanding, the kind only silence and shared history can hold. I asked if she wanted to talk about it, but she shook her head, lowering her gaze, instead gesturing to the sketchpad, revealing intimate studies of hands, faces, twisted forms of color that held both suffering and hope. It's easier this way, she said. I control it here, on paper, rather than in my head. I reached over, brushing lightly against the pad, a wordless acknowledgement that I saw her, truly, and respected her ways of coping. We settled into companionable silence again, the city below humming softly, streetlights flickering on, reflections dancing across wet asphalt. Slowly, our conversation drifted to the present, fleeting victories, frustrations that vanished with laughter, small stories of the construction site and her hospital rounds. Laughter broke the tension, subtle but genuine, and I realized that our bond wasn't forged in dramatic declarations but in these quiet, unguarded exchanges. The sky deepened to twilight, first stars appearing as tiny pinpricks against the indigo, and I offered my hand to help her up. She took it, fingers brushing mine, warm and grounding. Thanks for being patient with me, she said, and I shook my head, smiling. It's easy to be patient when I want to be here. We lingered a moment longer, simply watching the city, branches swaying in the breeze, traffic humming distantly, a rhythm continuing while we paused to exist in our shared quiet. I knew the shadows of her past would never fully fade, but so would these moments of trust, of resilience, of connection, quietly shaping the path ahead. Walking back together, steps matched in silent synchrony. I felt the weight and the promise of what we were building, a bond formed not just from understanding but from presence, from facing lingering fears and old scars side by side, finding light in corners where it had once been dim, step by deliberate step, moment by patient moment. Learning that courage could live in silence as much as it could in words. The house was quiet, but not empty, the kind of quiet that hums in your bones. The soft tick of the wall clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, even the faint scrape of a floorboard underfoot amplified in the stillness. I paused at the top of the staircase, flashlight trembling slightly, trained on the shadowed hallway that stretched ahead, edges blurred in dim lamplight. Every nerve was alert, every sense straining. As though the walls themselves were watching, holding their breath. The twins slept somewhere beyond my perception, soft, even breath steadying me, while downstairs the living room furniture waited like silent sentinels, ordinary but somehow foreign in the dark. A subtle click from behind the curtains made me freeze. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I slowly pivoted, the beam slicing through shadows that twisted and shifted, refusing to settle. Nothing moved, yet the absence was heavy, charged with expectation, with the undeniable sensation of eyes I could not see. I swallowed and stepped forward, deliberate, mapping the familiar spaces in my mind, the sofa, the rug, the coffee table, all inert, but now vessels of potential danger, each corner a question mark. The kitchen loomed ahead, light from the fridge spilling in muted patches across polished countertops, reflecting in a way that made the shadows seem to pulse. I opened the fridge slowly, letting the soft click echo through the empty space, listening, waiting. Then a flicker in the periphery, barely more than a suggestion, snapped my attention sideways. Heart hammering, empty, nothing. The house was breathing with me, or maybe against me. I advanced methodically, each step a negotiation between fear and reason, and for a long moment, the darkness pressed against my chest, insistent, patient, a weight I couldn't name. Thoughts of Anna, of fractured trust, hovered at the edges of my focus, but I pushed them aside. This was vigilance, survival, presence. Another whisper of sound, softer than a sigh, drifted from the study, barely perceptible, and I froze, muscles coiled, flashlight sweeping every angle, searching for form, for proof, for the flicker of movement that would confirm the unseen. The air felt thick, charged with tension, carrying the faint scent of old wood, paper, and lingering memories, as though the house itself had absorbed every argument, every laugh, every hurried step from decades past. Step by careful step, I moved, noting each detail, acknowledging shadows without letting them dominate, until I reached the living room again, the beam resting on a corner where light and dark collided. A soft click echoed once more, distinct but unplaceable. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself, reminding myself that fear was a signal, not a sentence. The night stretched endlessly, layered with expectation, each creak, each whisper, each imperceptible movement a test of resolve. And yet, I pressed on, steady and unwavering, knowing that endurance was not simply surviving the dark, but standing vigilant in it, presence as armor, love as shield, every nerve straining yet composed, ready to confront whatever lurked beyond sight. The house might conceal its secrets, might play tricks on perception, might tempt hesitation, but I would endure, through silence, through shadows, through the invisible presence pressing at the edges of awareness, guarding the small, sleeping lives above, and standing firm in the quiet certainty that no darkness, no unseen watcher, could unmake my resolve. The house breathed around me, every creak and sigh amplified in the heavy quiet, and I moved cautiously, boots silent against the hardwood, flashlight slicing through shadows that seemed to curl just beyond reach. Each step was deliberate, every corner a question, the familiar furniture suddenly alien under the weight of unseen observation. I paused near the study, senses taut, listening to the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional whisper of air through the vents. The quiet so complete it pressed against my chest. A subtle rustle behind me made my pulse spike. I spun, heart hammering, and found nothing but darkness folding in on itself. I forced a slow exhale, grounding myself in the rhythm of motion, the steady beat of my own nerves, reminding myself that fear was a signal, not a verdict. The children slept above, unaware of the tension threading through the house, their breathing even, comforting, a fragile anchor. I stepped into the living room, flashlight sweeping across familiar shapes, the sofa, the coffee table, the rug, but the shadows clung differently tonight, stretched in ways that felt deliberate, patient, almost teasing. A whisper of movement drifted from the hallway, faint, fleeting, and I froze mid-step, breath shallow, ears straining to catch the rhythm of a heartbeat that was not my own. Nothing, just the air shifting, carrying the scent of wood, paper, and lingering memories of days gone by. I pressed on, scanning the surfaces, noting angles, acknowledging darkness without letting it consume me. Each room was a gauntlet of perception, light against shadow, presence against absence. In the bathroom, the nightlight flickered softly, throwing the mirror into relief, and for a split second it seemed to hold a figure just beyond reach. I stared, unblinking, and the image dissolved into my own reflection, tense but alive. Step by careful step, I moved toward the staircase, toward the study again, where a soft click behind the curtains made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I paused, flashlight steady, every nerve alert, aware that the house had its own pulse, its own unseen rhythms, and that my presence was being tested at every turn. I could feel it in the air, the quiet insistence that I acknowledge what I could not see, confront the invisible, remain vigilant. And I did. Each heartbeat became a measure of commitment, each breath a quiet declaration that I would endure the tension, the uncertainty, the subtle menace of being watched without faltering. The night stretched on, long and deliberate, shadows shifting like living things, whispers threading through the rooms, yet I remained, steady and unbroken, moving through the darkness with patience, presence, and resolve. I knew that whatever lingered beyond perception, the echoes, the glimpses, the subtle hints of an unseen watcher, could not undo the choice I had made, to stand, to protect, to bear witness, and to remain the guardian of the lives sleeping above, steadfast against fear, against shadow, and against the quiet insistence of the dark. The house was full of secrets, but I would endure through each one, step by deliberate step, breath by measured breath, unwavering, present, and ready. I paused at the base of the staircase, hand resting lightly on the banister, the house pressing around me with quiet expectation, every creak and sigh amplified in the stillness, as if the walls themselves were listening. The children slept above, their breaths even, a fragile anchor in the tension threading through the rooms. I moved slowly, flashlight tracing edges of walls, furniture, and corners, shadows flickering like they had a life of their own, stretching familiar shapes into unfamiliar threats. A subtle shift in the living room caught my eye, a dim shape in the periphery that vanished the instant I looked directly, leaving only the unsettling sensation of eyes on me. Each step was deliberate, measured. The floorboards moaned softly under my weight, announcing me in whispers I hoped weren't answered. My mind raced, cataloging possibilities, rehearsing reactions, knowing that the house was full of echoes, past laughter, hurried footsteps, arguments long faded, but also that something new lingered. Unseen, patient, observing, I moved toward the kitchen. Flashlight sweeping over counters. The refrigerator's hum suddenly loud in the hush. A gentle metallic click echoing somewhere just beyond perception. Breath shallow, pulse quickened. I held myself steady, reminding myself that fear was a signal, not a sentence. A faint whisper from the hallway brushed my ear, so subtle I almost convinced myself it wasn't real, yet my senses sharpened, every muscle coiled, scanning for movement, for proof, for the invisible. The living room loomed again, corners dark, familiar furniture alien under my flashlight, and then, a soft click behind the curtains, deliberate, distinct, undeniable. I froze, pulse drumming, light cutting across shadows that seemed to shift with intent, my own breathing loud in contrast to the house's quiet insistence. Step by careful step, I advanced, scanning every angle, every surface, each room a test of focus, patience, and resolve. The air thickened with expectation, charged with presence that refused to reveal itself, and I felt the weight of vigilance settle deep in my chest. I reminded myself that endurance wasn't about erasing fear but standing in it, acknowledging what I could not see, moving through it with steady attention. The night stretched long, shadows crawling along walls, whispers threading the air, each subtle sound amplified by imagination and instinct alike. Yet I pressed forward, room by room, corner by corner, unwavering. The house might hide its secrets, might toy with perception, might demand that I confront unseen eyes at every turn, but I remained, the guardian, the witness, steady in the quiet insistence that presence matters more than certainty, courage more than comfort. And in that still, charged darkness, I understood that vigilance was not only protection, it was proof of care, a tether to those above, a quiet resistance against the weight of fear, a commitment to endure, unbroken, through shadows, whispers, and the unseen that tested the edges of reality. Step by deliberate step, breath by measured breath, I moved, steadfast, aware, and ready. I paused at the threshold of the study, flashlight cutting through the shadows, illuminating stacks of books, scattered papers, and framed photographs that spoke of a family both ordinary and fractured, each corner seeming to harbor secrets that refused to announce themselves. The air felt heavier here, thick with quiet expectation, and my pulse quickened as the sense of being watched crept along my spine, subtle, patient, impossible to ignore. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the house, seemed magnified, a potential signal that I was not alone, that something lingered just beyond perception. I stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, measuring distance, weight, presence, scanning surfaces, corners, and angles as though mapping the unknown. A faint shift near the window caught my eye, a shadow that melted away when I focused, leaving only tension in its wake. My breath slowed, then sharpened. My mind catalogued possibilities while instinct hummed beneath the surface. Alert, coiled, the soft click of a hinge echoed from the far corner. Quick, sharp, a whisper of sound that raised every hair on my neck. I froze, flashlight sweeping methodically, illuminating empty surfaces, familiar shapes rendered alien under the scrutiny of anxious eyes. Yet the feeling persisted, someone, or something, lingered just out of reach. Testing, waiting. I advanced toward the desk, air thick with unspoken presence, each object a potential witness, each shadow a question I could not answer. The quiet was electric, humming with anticipation, and I reminded myself that fear was a guide, not a captor, that vigilance, patience, and steady resolve were the shields that mattered. Every movement, every measured step, became part of the dance with the unseen, the house itself seeming to breathe around me, shaping and stretching moments, turning seconds into eternities. A subtle rustle from the shelves behind me made my chest tighten. I swung the light, nothing but the familiar objects, yet I felt the pulse of attention, the awareness of something observing, waiting, challenging me to remain unflinching. I let myself exhale slowly, grounding in the rhythm of motion, heartbeat syncing with the faint hum of the night beyond the windows, the occasional distant car, the whisper of air through the vents. Step by step, I moved through the study, confronting tension with deliberate courage, acknowledging the unseen without giving it power over me, each careful sweep of the flashlight a measure of resolve. The night outside deepened, shadows stretching long and deliberate, yet inside, I held firm, guardian, witness, steadfast in the commitment that presence mattered more than certainty, attention more than comfort. And in that charged, quiet darkness, I understood that endurance wasn't about vanquishing the unseen but facing it, step by deliberate step, breath by measured breath, aware that courage is found in persistence, vigilance in patience, and that the bond to those I protect, those sleeping safely above, was stronger than any shadow, any whisper, any unseen watcher the night could offer. I remained, unwavering, alert, ready, and unbroken. The house was quiet, too quiet, and every step I took across the hardwood floors seemed to echo like a warning, bouncing off walls lined with memories. Familiar shapes suddenly rendered strange in the dim glow of my flashlight. I moved methodically, each footfall deliberate, scanning corners, shadows, and the edges of the furniture, listening for the faintest hint of motion, the soft scrape of a chair leg, the whisper of air shifting, the subtle tick of a clock that suddenly seemed louder than it should be. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, a steady counterpoint to the tension curling along my spine. As I paused at the threshold of the hallway, senses stretched thin, every nerve alert. A faint click behind me made me spin, flashlight slicing through darkness, illuminating only empty space. Yet the sense of being watched clung to me, patient, persistent, impossible to ignore. I pressed on, careful, almost ritualistic, the familiar rooms feeling like a maze of shifting shapes, shadows stretching and recoiling as if alive, teasing, testing my resolve. In the study, papers fluttered slightly under a draft, a curtain twitched near the window, and I froze mid-step, chest tightening, waiting for a sign, any signal that this presence was more than my imagination. My eyes darted from shelf to desk to chair, tracing edges, patterns, reflections, cataloging details while my mind rehearsed every possible scenario: intruder, animal, nothing at all, and yet instinct whispered that none of the rational explanations mattered in this moment. A subtle rustle, just at the edge of hearing, made my pulse spike. I turned slowly, flashlight sweeping, illuminating empty corners, familiar objects suddenly uncanny, and I realized that the tension itself had become a presence, a rhythm, a companion in the night. I moved toward the kitchen, each step weighted, measured, senses straining to detect even the faintest irregularity, the faintest shift in sound or shadow. The hum of the refrigerator felt amplified, the soft lapping of distant rain against windows punctuating the silence, the occasional creak of floorboards resonating like a heartbeat, and I counted each breath, each footfall, grounding myself in awareness. Then, a whisper of movement behind the living room curtain, a subtle, deliberate shift, made my muscles coil, every sense alight, every nerve demanding attention. I advanced cautiously, flashlight tracing edges, light sweeping in arcs, shadows bending, stretching, retreating with each careful step. And I reminded myself that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. That vigilance is endurance measured in inches, seconds, breaths. By the time I reached the center of the room, the house seemed to hold its breath, quiet, expectant, shadows pressing close. Yet I stood firm, alert, ready for the unseen. The night stretched long, every movement deliberate, every sound a potential clue, every shadow a test, and I understood that being present, steady, and unwavering was the only way to confront whatever lingered unseen. And there, in the stillness, I realized that fear could be companioned, tension transformed into focus, and that facing the silent footsteps in the dark required only persistence, patience, and the unwavering commitment to endure, step by step, shadow by shadow, until the house returned to its measured, watchful calm. And I remained, the quiet sentinel, unbroken, alert, and ready for anything the night might offer. The house seemed to hold its breath as I approached the final hallway, the dim glow of the nightlight casting long, distorted shadows that clung to corners and walls, as if waiting for me to falter. Every step was deliberate, my boots pressing lightly against the hardwood, each creak amplified in the silence, each whisper of air a potential signal that I wasn't alone. The familiar floor plan felt alien tonight, hallways stretched, furniture loomed larger, and every doorway seemed to guard secrets I wasn't ready to confront. I paused outside the study, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip, heart hammering, senses straining to catch the faintest movement, a soft shift of air, the muted scrape of wood, the nearly imperceptible click that set my nerves alight. My pulse synced with the rhythm of the house, each beat echoing against walls lined with memories, with the past that seemed to linger in the corners like cobwebs waiting to snag the unwary. I stepped inside, sweeping the room in wide arcs, eyes cataloging every shadow, every object, every glint of reflected light, aware that the smallest detail could betray the presence I felt pressing just beyond sight. The air was thick, charged, almost tactile, carrying the faint scent of paper, old wood, and something else, something unidentifiable that made the hairs on my neck stand. A soft rustle behind the curtains froze me in place, breath catching in my throat. I advanced cautiously, flashlight cutting through the gloom, illuminating nothing but familiar furniture. Yet the sensation of being observed persisted, patient, methodical, unervingly intelligent. I rounded the desk, tracing every surface with deliberate care, ears straining to catch a sound that could be imagined yet felt impossibly real, the shadows bending slightly as if aware of my gaze. Then came the faintest click from the corner of the room, soft but distinct. An instinct propelled me forward, muscles coiled, every nerve ready, heart pounding like a drum in a silent hall. I stopped just short, flashlight beam steady, eyes scanning, breath measured, waiting for the next signal, knowing that hesitation could mean missing the truth. The room held its secrets close, yet I felt them palpably, an unseen threshold between the known and the unknown, a line I had to cross if I wanted clarity, if I wanted to protect what mattered. With deliberate calm, I pressed on, each step a negotiation between caution and courage, awareness and instinct, shadows retreating just enough to let the light pass, then creeping back like silent predators testing resolve. And then, in the stillness, I realized that the unseen wasn't just lurking beyond sight, it was a test, a challenge to endurance, to presence, to the commitment to remain unbroken. The night was long, each movement measured, every whisper of air, creak of wood, and flicker of shadow sharpening focus, teaching that vigilance was its own reward, that fear could be a compass, that strength was forged in patient observation. I understood, in that moment, that the threshold wasn't about confronting what I could see, but about standing firm against the unknown, embracing uncertainty, and remaining the quiet sentinel, step by deliberate step, breath by careful breath. I met the night head-on, unwavering, ready, knowing that however long the shadows lingered, I would endure, alert, steadfast, and prepared for whatever awaited just beyond the light. The hallway stretched before me, dark and silent, but the weight of the night had shifted, the tension now a tangible thread leading me forward rather than a shroud to paralyze me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of air, felt like a signal, guiding me toward the source of the unseen presence that had haunted the house. Threading through corners and shadows for weeks, I paused at the study doorway, flashlight steady, heartbeat loud but controlled, senses straining, and then I saw it, not a figure, not a threat, but evidence of life quietly observing, a subtle movement, the tilt of a photograph, the faint shifting of a chair that had once seemed immobile. And in that moment, clarity arrived. The presence wasn't malicious, wasn't a predator, it was a reminder, a reflection of vigilance, of care, of the way love and attention had etched themselves into every room I had walked, every step I had taken. The fear that had coiled through me loosened, replaced by awe, a quiet understanding that what I had felt was not danger but the weight of responsibility, the echoes of connection, the imprint of lives intertwined with mine, demanding recognition. I exhaled slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the walls one last time, seeing familiar furniture, childhood drawings, and the spaces where shadows had seemed alive now simply resting in peace. Each detail, each nuance I had catalogued over countless nights, formed a mosaic of endurance and trust, the unseen slowly made tangible through attention and care. And then the sound came, not a threat, not a click or a creak, but the soft murmur of life itself, the twins breathing from upstairs, Laura's gentle laughter from the kitchen as she cleaned the dishes, the faint hum of the refrigerator, ordinary yet profound, grounding me in reality, in presence. I realized that the house had never been empty, it had been waiting for me to see it, to embrace it, to accept that vigilance and connection were two sides of the same coin, and that courage wasn't about confrontation but presence, steady and deliberate. Shadows remained, yes, but they were no longer adversaries, they were witnesses, silent companions to a night spent proving that fear could be endured, that attention could illuminate what seemed unseen, and that love, in its quiet consistency, had the power to make even darkness familiar. I stepped back into the hallway, letting the flashlight's glow linger briefly on the polished wood. And for the first time, I felt the weight lift. The night receding not with a roar but with a soft, inevitable understanding. I had faced the unseen, traced its edges, acknowledged its presence, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. The storm of tension, the long vigil, the countless hours of waiting, all of it crystallized into a quiet triumph. A confirmation that resilience isn't loud, it's persistent. I turned toward the stairs, toward life above, the soft calls, the faint smells of dinner, the warmth of someone who had chosen to stay, and I knew that no shadow, no lingering doubt, no hidden fear could undo the bond that had been built, the trust that had taken root, the courage that had grown. That night, I learned that endurance isn't surviving the darkness alone, it's walking through it with others, feeling it behind you, beside you, and still choosing to move forward, step by careful step, into the light beyond the shadows, finally at peace with what had once seemed unseen.